Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Rutherford Hayes, and the focus is abandoning Southern blacks. The year is 1877. It's March 1st, 3 days from Inauguration Day, and Rutherford Hayes still doesn't know whether or not he's going to be president of the United States. The Electoral Commission was still working its way through the end of its process, but the governor of Ohio said, look, if I'm going to be there on time, I've got to get going. So I may not be gone long. I may be coming back if the Electoral College doesn't go my way, but I'm going to hit that train. And he and Lucy got on the way, and sure enough, the next day they got word at their stop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, that the Electoral College finished its task, and sure enough, the president-elect was Rutherford Hayes. He would be sworn in as the 19th president. He'd actually be sworn in early. The Hayeses arrived in Washington on the Saturday, March the 3rd. The 4th, the Sunday, well, that was sort of an off-limits day. Presidents weren't inaugurated on Sundays in the United States, and so he took his oath early at the White House. Outgoing President Ulysses Grant was his host. Morrison Waite, the Chief Justice, swore him in. Then they all got back together a couple of days later on the Monday, where they did it in public at the Capitol. Hayes had his inaugural address, touched on a number of topics. In this episode, we're going to focus on the rights of blacks in the South. Hayes said the people of those states are still impoverished, and the inestimable blessing of wise, honest, and peaceful local self-government is not fully enjoyed. It must not be forgotten that only a local government which recognizes and maintains inviolate the rights of all is a true self-government. It must be a government which submits loyalty and heartily to the Constitution and the laws of the nation and the laws of the states themselves, accepting and obeying faithfully the whole Constitution as it is. That last reference meant for all of the Constitution, including the recently passed amendments in the wake of the Civil War. Hayes continued that a moral obligation rests upon the national government to employ its constitutional power and influence to establish the rights of the people it has emancipated, and to protect them in the enjoyment of those rights when they are infringed or assailed is also generally admitted. This is clearly what Hayes believed, and if it's a mark on his presidency, then his presidency was a failure, because this was not fulfilled by the federal government. In fact, the actions of the federal government opened up the possibility for disenfranchisement and second-class citizen status for blacks in the South, which we'll cover here in a couple of moments. First, though, let's talk about Hayes' cabinet, important part of any administration, and he had a pretty good one, actually. He relied first on John Sherman, his own fellow Ohioan, who was the senator, who had a lot of good, strong economic background. He put in place the Secretary of the Treasury. William Evarts was given the Secretary of State job. He had just recently supported Hayes at the Electoral Commission, and Hayes was going to focus on civil service reform. This is one of the reasons why he took his one-term pledge, so he could take on the party bosses on both sides of the aisle, and he wanted a reformer in the cabinet. For that, he went for one of the leading reformers in the country, Schurz, who took over at the Interior Department. Overall, competent cabinet. They were loyal to Hayes. Most stuck around for the full 4 years. As for the White House, this was a family affair. Lots of family who would stay and visit, lots of guests who would be there. The First Lady, the hostess, Lucy Hayes, different from her predecessors. She was the first lady to have graduated from college. She was also different in that she made a decision that wasn't all that popular in Washington, particularly with the diplomatic corps. She banned alcohol from the White House. Yes, they called her Lemonade Lucy, and it was not a compliment. She also banned dancing. She banned card playing, but don't mistake that for not having a lot of social activity. There was plenty of social activity at the White House. It just didn't take on those forms, and the Hayeses didn't have any regrets about that. This was their house. They were going to live in it for 4 years, and they were going to live under the rules that they were comfortable with. And over time, most people got used to these and enjoyed the entertainment and the other social activities, one of which was precedent setting. Marie Williams came to sing at the White House at the invitation of Lucy Hayes, the first black ever to perform in the White House. There was also plenty of singing on other days, particularly on Sundays, when family and friends would gather to sing hymnals in the White House. Oftentimes, Secretary Schurz would be at the piano singing along. William Wheeler, the vice president, a widower, would show up often as well. So it was a sort of festive mood oftentimes in Rutherford Hayes' White House. But he had some serious business to take care of, and it had to do with what was going to happen in South Carolina and Louisiana on their governor and state races. Now, this was controversial ever since the election day, and it involved Hayes and his election over Sam Tilden, which had to do with whether or not some of these contested ballots should have been thrown out based on intimidation or violence. Those all went in the favor of Hayes. Now, they were going to talk about it in terms of the state level, the governorship and the state representatives. And we'll start with South Carolina. The Republican was Daniel Chamberlain, and just like the canvassing board gave the Electoral College votes to Hayes in the state, they gave the state to Chamberlain as well. But the Democrat, Waite Hampton, didn't accept that. He was challenging it, and the only thing that was keeping Chamberlain in the running for the governorship were the federal troops who were there to enforce the will of the canvassing board. So what did Hayes do? He invited both candidates to come to the White House. They had a meeting, they talked about it, and then Hayes met with his cabinet. What was he going to do? Well, this was a foregone conclusion. It was part of that compromise of 1877 where the Democrats stood down, allowed Hayes to sail into the White House on time, and with the tacit understanding that Hayes would end federal Reconstruction. He would take the troops out, the federal troops would be removed from the South, and they would let the Southerners decide for themselves who won things like these state elections. And that is what Rutherford Hayes decided to do. He gave the order on April the 10th. The soldiers marched out of Charleston. Immediately, Chamberlain said, I have no chance, so I'm going to back out of this. The Democrats took over the state house. White power was firmly back in place in South Carolina. What about Louisiana? Different approach, same result. Hayes appointed a commission to take a look into what was going on there. They met, they negotiated a little bit of a compromise, whereas the Democrats allowed some Republicans to take seats in the state legislature, but the Democrats got the majority. Democrats got the governorship, and that was Francis Nicholls. Now, Nicholls came out and he pledged the promotion of kindly relations between the white and colored citizens while promising the equal protection of all rights in the state without regard to race or color. And of course, this was nonsense. It's what they had committed to Hayes and the Republicans before the inauguration day when Hayes took over his role. It's what they're saying now, but of course, it would never happen. Nevertheless, Hayes ordered the federal troops to leave Louisiana on April the 24th. Federal Reconstruction was over, and white power had returned to the state houses across the South. Now, there was some criticism of Hayes over this. Not a lot, but there was some. Why wasn't there more? Well, the radical Republicans who had really been pushing this pro-freedmen agenda to get the South to give more rights to the blacks, including some of these constitutional amendments, well, some of them had died out, and the others just didn't have the power that they used to. As more states had been reconstructed, more Democrats had come into the legislature, all of a sudden they didn't have that sort of veto-proof majority that they could push any legislation they wanted, so they weren't going to be able to really impose their will anymore on the South. And we've already seen that the man in the White House, Rutherford Hayes, was not inclined to intervene because he was still convinced that his policy was going to work out for the best. Hayes said that I know how sore a trial this business is to staunch anti-slavery veterans like you. I expect many to condemn. I shall not worry or scold if they do. I know they mean well. It will, I trust, turn out that I am right, and he could not have been more wrong. Now, Hayes did try to maintain his commitment to the Southern blacks in one regard when Congress sent him a bill to repeal the statute that had given the federal government the authority to use troops to enforce the results of elections in the first place. Well, Hayes vetoed that bill. He said, there still may be some cases where I need this power and other presidents need this power. According to Hayes, experience has shown that the protection and conduct of national elections cannot be safely left to the states. If national military force is not allowed to keep the peace at the polls, civil authority should be provided for that purpose. Of course, Hayes never used this authority, even though the rights of blacks at the polls continued to degrade almost immediately. And let's take a look at that. The Democrats won big in the midterm elections, and that was partly a reflection overall of the Hayes administration, which was not that popular, but also the fact that the black vote practically disintegrated in the South. From the seceded states, 92% of senators going forward from that midterm election were Democrats. That was in the Congress and the House of Representatives. The number was almost that big in the Senate, 86%. They dominated that perspective. Now, Hayes complained about this because it was clear that the black vote was being suppressed. He said that by state legislation, by frauds, by intimidation, and by violence of the most atrocious character, colored citizens have been deprived of the right of suffrage, a right guaranteed by the Constitution and to the protection of which the people of those states have solemnly pledged. Well, big surprise, they didn't mean it. They didn't come through, and at this point, it was kind of getting to be too late. Rutherford Hayes had already removed the troops, and he frankly admitted that I am reluctantly forced to admit that the experiment was a failure. Now, what he called an experiment was a failure actually affected the lives of hundreds of thousands to millions of people for generations to come. That was the impact of this decision to get out of the business of federal Reconstruction and turn over home rule back to the white power. What was another piece of evidence that of the dramatic effect here was who was voting. Who was voting certainly was not blacks in the South anymore. The 15th Amendment said you couldn't discriminate on the right to vote based on race. Well, they found other ways to get around it. Black codes, poll taxes, literacy taxes, things that were technically legal, and the courts agreed to this. But it basically just disenfranchised blacks almost throughout the entire South. In 1868, 400,000 blacks voted in the presidential election. That was after the 15th Amendment had been passed. 12 years later, after Hayes ended Reconstruction in 1880, only 170,000 across the country, less than half. And this would be the case for quite some time. It was these other rules that were restricting not only the rights of blacks at the ballot box, but also rights across the board, as they were essentially turned into second-class citizens, and the federal government really did nothing about it. Now, Hayes' naivete was intact throughout this entire time. He was not giving up on his strategy. He wrote a letter to his friend Bryan in Texas that said, "My theory of the Southern situation is this. Let the rights of the colored people be secured and the laws enforced only by the usual peaceful methods, by the action of the civil tribunals, and wait for the healing influences of time and reflection to solve and remove the remaining difficulties. This will be a slow process, but the world moves faster than formerly, and it is plain that the politicians on both sides who seek to thrive by agitation and bitterness are losing rapidly their hold." And again, it was just wrong, unless he meant a really, really slow process. So let's put that into perspective. When Abraham Lincoln gave his Gettysburg Address, which was the year in which he also issued his Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, that went into effect. His opening line was 87 years ago. He was referring to the time from the Declaration of Independence to the present, 87 years. That was 87 years of slavery. That was a long time. You know how long it took to go from the end of Reconstruction by Rutherford Hayes in 1877 to the next real effort for civil rights legislation in the United States from the federal government? 87 years. It would be another 87 years until President Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act, which eventually started the process to try to bring blacks back into the rights to vote fully and more of their rights to the citizenry. Could it be a slow process? It absolutely was. And again, Hayes' naivete, thinking it would go any faster, was once again on display. Rutherford Hayes was a kind-hearted person, one of the most affable, friendly people ever to sit as President of the United States. He saw good in everyone, even in his enemies. He was a trusting soul. The problem was, sometime in politics, that doesn't work. And this miscalculation had devastating impact. Decades of discrimination against blacks in the South who simply had no legal remedy anymore. Now, Hayes and his successors, they could have done something, but essentially they turned a blind eye. It was local control. Their view of federalism was back in place. So one of the kindest men ever to sit in the White House ended up committing one of the most unkind acts by any president. One of the worst results from any action of any president in American history emanated from Rutherford Hayes' decision to end Reconstruction in 1877. And that is Rutherford Hayes and Abandoning Southern Blacks from the life of Rutherford Hayes. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.